All right, in this video, we're going to take a more in-depth look into the structure of the skeletal muscle fiber. There are some things going on inside of it that are going to be really important to how it functions. And mostly we're going to talk about the structures themselves today and not necessarily how they function, but we're going to get into how they function and why their structure is related to their function in the next few lectures. So here we have a skeletal muscle fiber. Remember that fibers are basically single cells. They have a single cellular membrane that is called the sarcolemma, but they are long, thick structures that are multinucleated and are actually made from the fusion of many cells together. Remember that the muscle fiber is surrounded by a reticular connective tissue called the endomysium. That's what's going to be surrounding this whole thing. Underneath the endomysium, you can see here this structure that's been kind of peeled back here. That's the sarcolemma. That's the cell membrane of this fiber. It's a normal cell membrane with like phospholipids and proteins and everything like that. We're just giving it a special name because it's on the muscle fiber. So we're going to call it a sarcolemma. Inside the sarcolemma, we have the cytoplasm of the cell, and that cytoplasm is called the sarcoplasm. And it's going to be full of contractile proteins arranged in what are called myofibrils. So each of these bundles of contractile proteins is a myofibril, and the nuclei are going to be squished off to the side, and the mitochondria will either be squished off to the side or will be squished in between the myofibrils. Now, taking a blow-up view here, you can see that there's actually a lot of complicated stuff going on inside here. Let's start off by taking a look at the myofibrils themselves. You can see that this is a myofibril here, and this that has been extended out. This is also a myofibril, and it's been bisected so that we can look at the inside of it. Myofibrils are actually made of two main components. There are two main contractile proteins. They basically pull against each other during contraction. So we have here what are called thick filaments, and we have thin filaments. Let's actually do the thin filaments in green, because I can. And what you have is this staggered structure where you have a thick filament in the middle, and it's flanked by thin filaments to its left and right, above and below. Thick filament, thin filaments. Okay? The thin filaments are they're all connected together by this squiggly line over here called a Z-disc, because it makes like Z's. And so all of the thin filaments will be connected together with this ziggy-zaggy Z-disc, and the thick filaments are going to be in between, right? So they will border two thin filaments, one on their left, one on their right. The area between two Z-discs is called a sarcomere, and it is one contractile unit, right? So the sarcomere is the thing that does the contracting. We will talk in a couple of lectures about exactly how the sarcomere goes about contracting, but that's the unit that is going to contract. A myofibril is made of a whole bunch of sarcomeres connected in a line, right? So we have a sarcomere here, a sarcomere here, and then you keep going back and you're just going to have sarcomere after sarcomere after sarcomere. They all contract together at about the same time, and that's what produces muscle contraction. Second important thing to know is there's all of these pubi structures here, and they're super important for regulating when and how the muscle contracts. There are two important types of tubi things here. First one that I want to talk about is what is called the T-tubules, or transverse tubules. That is these things here in blue. You'll note that they're in the same color as the sarcolemma up here. That's not on accident. These T-tubules are actually connected to the sarcolemma. So the cell membrane is going along here normally, and there's a little pore in the sarcolemma, in the cell membrane, where the cell membrane suddenly dips down into this big chasm, and that big chasm becomes the transverse tubule. Remember, transverse means across or through. And they run all the way through as like this big cavern from one side to the other. So the inside of the T-tubule is technically outside of the cell, just like the inside of your intestines is outside of your body, technically. Things can move through from your mouth all the way out the other end, and they never have to actually cross a barrier into your body. They never have to actually open up a wound in you to do so. Similarly, things could pass from the outside of the cell through the T-tubule all the way across to the T-tubule on the other side and then out, and they would never have to actually cross the cell membrane. They could get from one side of the cell to the other side of the cell through that tunnel without ever going inside the cell, technically. Where you have the T-tubule, the transverse tubule running, you see these kind of orangey red things next to it. These tubules here are the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You may recognize that term a bit. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of a muscle fiber. Right? So it's the same structure. Well, it's a specialized variant of the smooth ER. But if you recall, when we were talking about the endoplasmic reticulum, we said that, its main functions are to detoxify the cell and make lipids. And then there was this one that said, and when it's the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it also contains calcium. This is a specialized version of the smooth ER that's main function is to contain calcium inside of the cell. So this is an internal organelle of the cell. All right? It's not outside the cell, it's inside the cell. It's an organelle, it's the smooth ER. And this smooth ER has been formed into all of these tunnels. I'm actually going to do this in green. It's going to be easier to see. All of these tunnels that are running next to the myofibrils. And these tunnels contain calcium. And you can see as these tunnels get close to the T-tubule, the transverse tubule, all of these tunnels kind of join together into a big tunnel that runs right next to the T-tubule. So all of these little tunnels join together into a big tunnel that runs right next to the T-tubule on both sides of the T-tubule. So over here as well. And you'll have all of these little tunnels of the sarcoplasmic reticulum running into it. This big tunnel here, that's called the terminal cistern. It's where all of the little tunnels of the sarcoplasmic reticulum empty into. They all empty into that terminal cistern. And so the terminal cistern is full of calcium, and it runs on either side of the transverse tubule. This is a structure you see all over the place in muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers, where you'll have a transverse tubule, a T-tubule in the center, flanked by two terminal cisterns. That together, that structure, is called a triad. And you can see here, a triad is a transverse tubule flanked by terminal cisterns on either side. And they're located really close together. Anytime you see a transverse tubule, it should be part of a triad. Here's a slightly different view of the muscle fiber, and you can see a few additional features on this. So here we see our triad, right? So you can see in pink, we have the transverse tubule going down. And then here in blue, we have our terminal cisterns and the connected caverns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum that are all basically wrapped around these myofibrils. You can actually see in the outside of the sarcolemma, remember sarcolemma is the cell membrane, you can see these little pores, holes. Those pores are where the T-tubule starts. So they are the beginning of the cavern that becomes the T-tubule and goes across the cell. You can also see here, right? So this is a Z disc right here. And this over here, it's a little bit obscured, but this is another Z disc over there. So in between the two Z discs, we have a sarcomere. And that sarcomere can be subdivided into two different bands. Right? So the area where there is thick fiber is called the A band. So anytime where there's thick fiber, that's called the A band. The area where there is only thin fibers, only thin filaments, is called the I band. And note that the A band will always be in between two Z discs. So it will always be within one sarcomere. And the I band will always consist of a Z disc and the thin filaments going out from either side. So here we have our Z disc and the thin filaments going out from either side. And the eye band is just the region where there are thin filaments but no thick filaments. The area where you have both thick and thin filaments that is called the zone of overlap. And we'll go over all that again when we get into the function of the sarcomere. All right, so I just want to remind you, these are the really important terms for you guys to know for this section. The sarcolemma is the plasma membrane, the cell membrane of the muscle fiber. The sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber. Inside the sarcoplasm, you will find myofibrils. These are those long contractile protein bundles that are made out of chained sarcomeres. You will also, in the sarcoplasm, find glycogen in storage granules, and it's there primarily to basically, they're energy stores for the cell, right? So it's got glucose in case it needs glucose. And you will also find myoglobin. We'll talk more about myoglobin later on, but it's a relative of hemoglobin. And just like glycogen exists to store glucose in the cell, myoglobin exists to store oxygen in the cell. You will have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is derived from smooth ER that forms many, many tubules that coat around a myofibril and that gather at ends into terminal cisternae, which are end sacs of the sarcoplasmic reticulum that cross the muscle fiber from one side to the other. And the function of the sarcoplasmic reticulum is to contain calcium. The T-tubules are basically caverns made of sarcolemma, the cell membrane that cross from one side of the muscle fiber to the other side of the muscle fiber. They're infoldings of the sarcolemma that penetrate the cell and emerge on the other side. So muscle fibers all have holes running through them. And running alongside of the T-tubules, you will always find a terminal cistern on either side. And that structure of one T-tubule flanked by two terminal cisternae is called a triad. All right, make sure that you're absolutely clear on the structure of the muscle fiber and on these important terms, because we're going to be talking about them a lot later on.